Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, as Governor mentioned, I have a more attractive headline of my presentation than usual. Normally, I start my presentation by saying that its structure will be the standard one that you are used to. But today it will be different, and that's why I decided to look for a smart headline of the presentation. And because in our inflation report we have two major scenarios, the first thing that came to my mind was Charles Dickens' a story or a tale of two cities. So I decided to call the presentation A Tale of Two Stories after the two key forecast scenarios. But then I decided, or I realized that two is actually not enough, which brought me more to Anton Pavlovich Chekhov's Three Sisters, and we all know in the Czech Republic that two sisters would not be enough in that book. But then actually I realized that we have two subversions of the third scenario, so basically it's 3 to 4. So it's, in the end, it's something like Alexander Dumas' most famous book, which is called 3, but there are actually 4. But anyway, I will start describing the motivation for the decision of the CNB's bank board to start using exchange rate as another instrument of easing monetary conditions. And I will start doing this with using the baseline scenario of our forecast with hypothetically negative interest rates, which of course cannot be delivered in practice, to see how much monetary easing is required according to our analysis. And I will also provide a few further stylized facts about the current state of the Czech economy. Then I will go to another scenario, a counterfactual one, of what we see that would have happened if the monetary policy have remained passive. And these we actually have in two subversions. Then I will go to a brief comparison of the baseline scenario with unrealistically negative rates and the alternative scenarios in which the central bank is using exchange rate as its instrument. And in the end, I will compare all the scenarios before summarizing and concluding. So let me start with the missing interest rate cuts, the motivation for the decision. Our baseline scenario has showed for the first time that consistent with this forecast is a significant decline in market rates well below zero. In the previous forecast, we had the market interest rates close to zero, which implicitly meant negative monetary policy rates with the prevailing risk premium in the money market. But the market rates in those forecasts remained positive. Now we, for the first time, moved to negative market interest rates, which is not possible to deliver in practice. And this suggested that monetary policy needs to use a different instrument to ease monetary conditions. This is basically for the what the market interest rate implied for our 2-week repo rate, the key policy rate, assuming that the money market risk premium stays at the current 0.4 of a percentage point. And basically, this would imply that a need to have 2-week repo at minus 0.9% early next year, which in other words means that there are 4 missing interest rate cuts compared to 2 in the previous forecast. So basically, the need to ease further has doubled compared to the board's discussion in August. Here you can see the downward shift of the interest rate path in comparison with the previous forecast. So you can see that really it's a significant downward shift for the next few quarters. What are the reasons for this downward shift in the interest rate path? One of the important factors is regulated prices and its outlook for next year. It is the black bars in the graph. But I would like to stress that it is not only regulated prices. Actually, the pressure on lower rates, according to our analysis, is quite broad-based. Besides the regulated prices, there is also a downward effect of lower than expected net inflation, so market-driven prices in the third quarter of this year, as well as its lower near-term forecast for the fourth quarter this year. So the whole second half of this year is witnessing lower market-determined prices than we had expected in the previous forecast. The wage growth in the private sector is much more subdued. It has declined to historically lowest levels. You cannot see wages directly in this chart, but it's part of the downward red bars called initial state. And the size of these red bars actually understates the actual downward pressure from wages, because the initial state also includes the starting level of the interest rates, which quite naturally did not evolve in line with the previous forecast that assumed further rate cuts, and we were in practice stuck at the zero lower bound. There is basically only one visible upward factor in this chart, which is foreign environment. But when we were discussing, or when the board was discussing this forecast, this upward effect was seen as largely notional, not something realistic, because it was based on, at that time, an outdated market outlook for interest rates, which has shifted slightly up to the previous forecast. But in the end, you all know that the ECB actually decided to deliver another unexpected cut in its key policy rate, and now people are talking about further measures potentially coming from the ECB side to ease monetary conditions further. At the same time, we revised significantly downwards our outlook for CPI inflation next year, and the new forecast, even with its artificial assumption of negative rates, assumed that headline inflation would fall to zero level and monetary policy inflation would get slightly negative, which is an understatement of what would happen if we had remained passive, as I will show you later on. At the same time, I would like to stress that the downward shift in the forecast of inflation and the very subdued inflationary environment is not just a reflection of falling regulated prices, mainly of falling electricity price and gas price for households. These are, of course, factors which are contributing to it, but the truth is that core inflation, so the measure which is basically excluding all the items of the basket which are frequently hit by supply side shocks, has been negative already since mid-2009, so more than 4 years at the moment. But within that, we now see an important, or for us an important qualitative shift, in the sense that until now, falling prices within core inflation were only reflection of falling prices of tradables, while non-tradables, so basically services, have continued to grow at moderate rates, but continued growth, which is kind of natural state of the situation. But now, for the first time in our history of independent Czech Republic, actually services prices stopped growing. There is broadly a stagnation in the prices of non-tradables. And true, there is one item which stands out in this. It's telecommunications, but we think it's not just about that. We see it also as a reflection of the broad economic weakness. This economic weakness can be illustrated by various estimates of the output gap. You know that we are using several concepts which are shown in this chart. And you can see that different methods, of course, give you a different size of the estimated output gap. But all of them show that the output gap is significantly negative, and the range of estimates is broadly -2 to -4. And by way of comparison, this is more negative than, for example, in 1998, 1999. And you may remember that at that time there was a lot of critique of the central bank that monetary conditions were too tight for the economy, and now we are in a situation in which the output gap is actually even more negative. There was a slight recovery in the second quarter of 2013, and as a result of that, the output gap closed a little bit. But qualitatively, this hasn't changed our assessment of the output gap as being very on the anti-inflationary side. And moreover, after the flash estimate for the third quarter, which was surprisingly bad, even for us, basically, I think the correct assessment is that we are close to the bottom of the business cycle, and the recovery so far is relatively modest and not shifting the economy from its anti-inflationary position. Here I would also probably note that the models which would explicitly work with output gap as the main indicator of the domestic economy's impact on inflation would probably forecast even more muted price developments, because here you can see that the output gap is unlikely or would not close before end 2015, even with the artificially assumed negative rates. So basically on the forecast horizon in an output gap model, you would get downward pressures on prices. So if there is a model uncertainty here, I would see it as skewed towards even more disinflation. For those that like it monetarist, I've added this chart. We got some very lively responses to our decision from the monetarist camp, and actually one of them was enthusiastically positive, and some of them were enthusiastically critical. But the point that I want to make here is that it is correct and it is true that the broad monetary aggregate has continued to growing at modest rates. But nevertheless, what matters for the nominal GDP developments in the end, it's not just M, the money in circulation, but it's actually M times V, money times its velocity. And velocity has not been stable in the Czech economy. You can see here that it moves quite a lot. This is expressed in year-on-year changes. And you can see that now it's significantly declining. So even with growing nominal monetary aggregate, we actually saw slightly declining nominal GDP in the first part of this year, and now basically nominal GDP dynamics, it's close to zero. So from this effective M times V point of view, we are actually at the borderline between monetary inflation and monetary deflation. Okay, this was the motivation for the decision. Now I'm going to talk about what would have happened with no policy action, which was, of course, a crucial question for the board's consideration. And we believe that you could not reasonably expect that the central bank would just keep rates at zero and abstain from intervention, and yet exchange rate would remain as stable as in the baseline scenario with negative rates, and also all the other macro variables would evolve in line with that artificial forecast. And we have thought that, or it was our belief that it is basically not able to maintain credibility once we have passed all the previously communicated triggers for interventions, in the sense that there are not just 1 or 2 missing rate cuts, but there are 4. And we actually forecast deflation, at least a temporary one, and we would still be able to keep effective our verbal interventions. So we actually simulated two scenarios of passive monetary policy and presented it to the board, and it had 2 subversions differing in the severity of the impact depending on how much exchange rate would appreciate in response to our no action. And of course, this is a kind of what-if analysis, a kind of counterfactual scenario which you're not going to see in practical developments, but these counterfactual scenarios are extremely important in assessing policy. So here I'm comparing the baseline scenario with 2 versions of the passive monetary policy scenario. The more benign one, or I would say less severe one, it's the one in black line, in which the exchange rate would appreciate, but relatively modestly. And even this would be enough to generate deflation lasting at least 2 quarters next year, and it would keep the economic recovery much more visibly more muted than in the baseline scenario, because the real economy would be hit by stronger exchange rate, and it wouldn't be supported by the assumed negative rates in the baseline. But we thought a risk that FX market may actually overreact to our passivity, and there could be a much sharper, much visible appreciation, which was seen as the key short-term risk for the more benign or less severe passive monetary policy scenario. So in the green line, you have a scenario in which a further shock to the exchange rate on the appreciation side is added, and you can see that quite obviously the deflation would become deeper, and it would last for longer, and the speed of economic recovery would be even weaker. This was the key short-term risk for the scenario. A long-term risk that was discussed quite a lot was that even in these passive interest rate scenarios, in the end, inflation returns to the 2% target, because on the long-term end of the forecast, it is still the center of gravity, the target towards which the inflation quite naturally tends to converge in our model, but in reality, this may not be the case. If monetary policy is passive, people start seeing deflationary developments, their inflation expectations could become de-anchored, and inflation could stay persistently low or even persistently in the negative territory. So we felt that it's not possible to remain passive, and that the CNB should consider using an alternative instrument. And you know that since autumn last year, we've been communicated that such an instrument would be the exchange rate. So we simulated the alternative scenario with the exchange rate tool, in which the exchange rate is shifted by an action from the central bank side to the vicinity of Czech crown euro 27. So it means basically a depreciation of 4 to 5%, not 45, 4 to 5. I just stress this. Compared to the exchange rate prevailing before the decision. And of course, given that after the meeting, or at the end of the meeting, the board actually decided to move the exchange rate to this level, this scenario has actually become the most probable description of the expected future economic developments out of all the 4 scenarios that I'm presenting here. In the comparison of the baseline with artificially or hypothetically negative rates and the alternative with the exchange rate instruments, there are some shared common assumptions, for example, about external developments or discretionary fiscal measures. So I will start describing these, and then I will give you the comparison of the domestic developments in these 2 scenarios. And again, I need to stress here that if you see the difference between the baseline and the alternative, in general, the difference between passive and active monetary policy would be even bigger, and you will see it at the end of my presentation. So as regards the external economic environment, foreign demand growth has been quite muted, and foreign producer prices are even declining. And the market consensus expects that this is the bottom of the cycle and that the situation will be gradually improving. While interest rates will remain at rather low levels for the whole forecast horizon, but still with some tendency to increase later on. But here, as I've already mentioned, we saw a significant downward risk because of the efforts of the European Central Bank to ease monetary conditions further. As regards fiscal policy, it has been significantly restrictive this year. We expect that the realized measures have subtracted from this year's GDP minus 0.6 of a percentage point. We actually have a slightly restrictive fiscal policy for next year, at least based on the unchanged policy assumption as a carryover from the previous consolidation measures. And we are actually slightly lower here, slightly more negative than in the previous forecast because public investment is recovering somewhat more slowly than we had expected. And then, based on the legislation which is now in place, we have a slight expansionary fiscal impulse in 2015. Here you can also see the comparison of the government overall budget deficits in the 2 versions of the forecast. In the baseline with hypothetically negative rates and in the alternative scenario. And quite naturally, in the alternative scenario, the fiscal outcomes are slightly better. There are slightly smaller deficits because of a positive because of a positive cyclical contribution of fast recovery in the alternative scenario. This is the comparison of the key variables between the baseline. You can see the baseline artificially negative rates, while in the alternative, rates can stay at 0 without causing macro problems because it's the exchange rate shifted to 27, which is loosening the monetary conditions. And thanks to that, the inflation returns to our target faster than in the baseline. It gets there already in the second half of this year. And there is faster economic recovery in 2014, and these two factors are gradually feeding into faster nominal wage growth, which is an important part of the story. As regards the monetary policy relevant inflation, again, if you look at the alternative with the exchange rate instrument, it is returning to the target faster than in the artificial baseline. It actually moves temporarily into the upper half of the tolerance band of our target at the turn of 2015, thus facilitating the recovery of the economy via the real interest rate channel. And also, this makes the the eventual future exit from the zero lower bound more robust than otherwise. And then the monetary policy inflation during 2015 converges back to the target from above. Of course, behind this impact of the exchange rate depreciation on inflation, there is some notion of the exchange rate pass-through. And during last year, as we were talking about the potential use of the exchange rate, I was getting from you questions about the estimated size of the exchange rate pass-through. And my general answer was that at the zero lower bound, the exchange rate pass-through may actually become stronger than in normal periods because the exchange rate move tends to be more durable, and because monetary policy is not working against the initial shift in the exchange rate by increasing the interest rates. And here I'm just illustrating this idea by a few impulse responses from our core forecasting model, which show a shock to the exchange rate equivalent to 4.7%, so the size that we did, but differ based on how long the zero lower bound is binding, ranging from binding zero lower bound 1 quarter to 4 quarters. And you can see that the impact on CPI is progressively increasing the longer the zero lower bound binds. And you can see that this is basically also true for the impact on the real GDP growth and on real consumption. And for real consumption, I would actually like to contrast the red line, which is more or less the standard situation, in which the initial response of consumption is marginally to the downside. And I believe this is the effect which is now very much mentioned in the public debate. So inflation goes up, real incomes of people decline, so they can consume a little bit less. But if you take into account the fact that interest rates in nominal terms stay at 0, inflation goes up, so real interest rates are relaxed, the economy starts to recover, the impact is bigger, etc. The nominal wage growth starts to increase at faster rates. In those scenarios in which you assume the zero lower bound lasting for 3 or 4 quarters, you actually have a positive effect on even on household consumption. Okay, as regards the breakdown of the inflation outlook, we have declining regulated prices in 2014 in both scenarios. Actually, the regulated price outlook is the same in both scenarios, which is to some degree a simplification. We should probably should have reflected some upward impact on the depreciated exchange rate, also on the administered prices. But in terms of the overall inflation, this impact would be just 0.1 of a percentage point. So we decided to neglect it because in relation, for example, to the uncertainty about the size of the pass-through, this is a minor issue. And of course, in the alternative with the depreciated exchange rate, market prices tend to start growing faster. And it is because all major segments of the market prices start growing faster with different degrees of elasticities. Here you can see that we see a relatively moderate impact on food inflation, which will, even after the depreciation of the exchange rate, it will remain in the moderate interval from 2 to 3%. And we have a somewhat more visible effect on core inflation here. Also, I would like to stress that even after the action of monetary policy, the average annual inflation rate for next year that we are expecting is 1.3%. So we are not talking here about a major inflationary spike. 1.3% is actually the second lowest annual inflation rate in a decade. In 2015, we are slightly above 2% because, as I said, inflation temporarily moves into the upper half of the corridor. But if you actually take the average of 2014 and 2015, it's exactly 2%, which is a number that might sound familiar for most of you. And it also answers to some extent the question, where did 27 level come from in our scenario? So this is finally a comparison of all the four scenarios, and from the policy assessment point of view, the relevant comparison is actually between the alternative scenario with the exchange rate instrument, which is the blue line. So that's what we expect to happen once we did what we did. And the passive monetary policy counterfactual scenario in its two versions. Basically, I'm sorry to say that because it was a lot of work invested by my department, but the baseline is that. And so it's still here in the pictures, but it's not for us not a relevant part of the policy assessment anymore. And here you can see that the difference between active and passive monetary policy is clearly visible for all major variables, and it goes in the favorable direction. So we get faster to the inflation target and on average stabilize inflation close to 2%. We avoid the deflationary risk, which is associated with the passive monetary policy scenarios. We speed up the recovery of the real economy, and once the exit starts, and I'll talk about it at the end of the presentation, it can be more robust. You can take off from the zero lower bound in a more robust way. Speaking about the real economy, you may ask, does it pay off because you are higher in 2014 but lower in 2015? But well, in 2015, we are lower with the forecast to a large extent because of the base effect from the faster recovery in 2014. And therefore, it's actually also good to look at the levels of economic activity and the subcomponents of aggregate demand. And if you look at it from this point of view, you actually can see that the impact is clearly positive because you recover faster. And if you sum up the production over the whole forecast period, you are in real terms 40 to 60 billion crowns higher than with the passive monetary policy. Of course, in nominal terms, the difference is even bigger because you at the same time have a higher trajectory of the price level. You can also see that consumption is below the artificial baseline forecast, but forget about it because in the baseline, consumption is stimulated by negative rates. So it's kind of virtual reality. If you compare it with the passive monetary policy scenario, the difference is actually positive. So households start consuming more. And of course, you can see higher real exports. To some extent, also it feeds into imports, of course, because our exports are import intensive, but on balance, net exports improve. There is also a clear and visible impact on the labor market. In the right-hand chart, you can see that if you compare the alternative scenario with exchange rate instruments to the passive monetary policy, the general unemployment rate is about half a percentage point lower than, so half a percentage point lower. And if you convert it into the number of people, this is of course a relatively significant number. And at the same time, nominal wages start growing faster. So true, people will face somewhat higher price level, but they will also start earning more. This is the story condensed in our model terms, how we depict inflationary developments. And you can see that in the alternative scenario with the exchange rate instruments, the initial impulse to higher inflation comes from the red bars, which is import prices, but then importantly it feeds into the domestic economy, which helps to bring inflation back to the 2% target on a sustainable basis. While if there was passive monetary policy, and this is the less severe scenario, so we could imagine even worse outcomes, you would actually get overall deflationary pressures at the beginning of 2014, and it would be because all remaining small pressures from import prices would fade away with the appreciation of the exchange rate, and the domestic economy would remain in the subdued situation. And the basic difference as regards the domestic economy and its impact on inflation between the two scenarios, active and passive monetary policy, it's in the speed of recovery of the nominal wage growth. Finally, this is what the scenarios imply for the two-week repo rate, so artificially or hypothetically negative in the baseline, and in all the other scenarios staying at the zero lower bound or at technical zero before an exit can start taking place. Here, it is fair to say that the scenario assumes the exit could start around the beginning of 2015. Of course, this scenario was simulated before the board. The scenarios were simulated before the board discussed the situation and before the board took the decision. So the board, as normally, can deviate from the interest rate path. It can also take a different view on the timing of the exit. And it's quite obvious that the exit needs to be very careful to avoid premature exit. Of course, should, for example, the exchange rate pass-through prove weaker than we have in our forecast, it would be an argument for a later exit, and of course the macro situation may also change, and if more anti-inflationary pressures appear, again a later exit would be a natural response. So let me summarize. We came to the conclusion that the situation required further monetary easing and that passive monetary policy would have significant costs. And on the other hand, the alternative scenario has showed us that depreciating the exchange rate by 4 to 5% on a rather relatively durable basis has positive implications, basically for all goals of monetary policy. And that's why the board took the decision and communicated that we are resolved to sell korunas in such volumes and duration as needed to achieve the desired exchange rate with the aim of hitting the inflation target in the future. So that's all. Thank you for your attention. My presentation was longer than envisaged in the program, but I felt that that's appropriate for the current situation. So sorry for that, but thank you, and I pass the floor back to Mr. Governor.
Right, thanks. Well, we may first, if needed, we will start our lunch later, allowing at least usual half an hour for discussion, if needed, of course. That's the first message. Second message is that, as usual, we have 3 types of questions here. Those requiring knowledge and wisdom, which will be handled by Tomáš, those requiring wisdom, which will be handled by Lubomír, and those neither requiring wisdom and neither requiring knowledge will be handled by myself, I believe. So in a normal hierarchy of a big organization that I'm sure is familiar for many of you. Okay, so let me ask for first question, and let me remind anybody asking a question to introduce himself and institution he is affiliated with, or she is affiliated with. Sorry. So please, please.
Pavel Sobíšek, Unicredit Bank. I have a question about the exit, which is maybe far away, but it is definitely what the market will concentrate on since now, or from now on. So your alternative model, which has become the baseline one, suggests that interest rates should start rising at the end of 2014. At the same time, you, Governor, has indicated that the fixed exchange rate regime will last at least for 1.5 years. So I would like to ask both board members presented here whether they expect or can imagine the situation that interest rate, I mean repo rate, will start hiking at the same time with the fixed exchange rate regime.
Okay, I will start the question. One of the key parameters was already mentioned by Tomáš, and this is actually the size of the pass-through, which might be different from what we have assumed. So this is one big question on the end. But the second one, which is I think more important, is the property of the long-term equilibrium, which is hidden at the end of the model. So basically, the model has assumed that at the end of the monetary policy horizon, we will be in a steady state of the normal policy. And this is probably for me the question of the timing, whether actually the model and our action will be sufficient to actually get the equilibrium in the monetary policy horizon, or whether actually, since the models are probably more reliable in short-term or medium-term prediction of the monetary policy. So from this perspective, I would say that currently it's sort of envisaged by the model, but definitely this is something which is not fixed, and it will definitely depend upon these two parameters. And finally, and I think this is why we have sort of always stressed the building of the inflationary pressures, that will be actually a signal that we can thinking about the tightening of monetary conditions.
Well, let me try to answer in probably plainer language. As you probably noted, we have been using interest rate mantra on necessary to hike after we see a buildup of significant or more significant inflationary pressures for quite a while, and in the meanwhile, I realize we are essentially saying that we will hike as soon as we are damn sure that we will not have to cut in a foreseeable future. Yeah. The same thing is about timing. I definitely. It's enough for me to start intervention during my term once. I would not relish repeating this experience at all. Yeah. So that's probably part of the answer. If you ask me on my current thinking, that can change at any point of time, I'm afraid. I would more expect to quit intervention and not hike immediately. Simply because we will be quitting intervention at a point of time in which we will be sure that the economy is and inflation can afford appreciation of currency. That's I believe quite clear. And as the regime or the event will be quite unknown, I would probably quit with carefulness. But saying this, well, that's my current thinking. Yeah. Tomáš has a technical note. Great.
Just technically, to avoid confusion, the scenarios actually assume that zero repo rate will prevail until the very end of, or throughout the whole 2014. So you said it starts increasing in late 2014. It's actually early 2015. But more important note, one of the factors which is actually contributing to this increase is that all the scenarios assume that by the time interest rates in the euro area will already be growing. And if this is the case, of course, you can start gradually hiking without changing the interest rate differential and without causing a sharp exchange rate appreciation. But of course, there may be downward risks to this if the ECB continues to ease and if they feel they need monetary easing also in 2015. And the foreign interest rate shift down, the trajectory would shift down as well, and even in those technical scenarios, without considering the monetary policy aspects of the exit, the zero lower bound would be in place for a longer period.
Other questions, please?
Wojciech Benda, BH Securities. I have the question which probably won't be answered completely, but it concerns the 27 level. They've been put on table many arguments and that why to maintain the 27 level at the exchange rate and prevent the exchange rate against the appreciation. A hypothetical question: what if the development of financial markets will turn into the opposite direction and there will be depreciation pressures? And how sensitive would be the central bank against the depreciation of the currency above this level, which cannot be fully ruled out when we see the development in the Eurozone and the discussion about possible further softening of the ECB policy, and whether we can assume 27 is a medium-term target, or is it the floor for the exchange rate? Thank you.
Well, our traders are entitled to buy foreign currency, not to sell it. You get clear answer than you probably expected, but it's written actually. It's written in our decision. Yeah, there's no news on this. Question, please.
Yeah, I raised the hand. I'm just not seen. So it seems to me that one of the crucial assumptions underlying the conclusions that you've reached and the decisions that you've taken is, and also the channel through which you hope to help the economy, is to stimulate or to push households into spending more. And the underlying assumption seems to me to be, correct me if I'm wrong, that they're not spending because they expect prices to fall. Or well, I mean, I've spoken to a few people recently, and non-economists, and they didn't say that, they didn't even know what the inflation was. That's for starters. And certainly didn't know that there was the threat of the deflation. That's why so many people were taken by surprise by our decisions. And so, do you really think this is the reason for households not spending, or don't you think that it may be something else, like, you know, them being afraid of losing a job 2 years from now or two months from now?
Well, honestly, you are reflecting the focal point of public debate, not the focal point of our decision. And let me remind you that this sort of debate actually was carried out intensively in 20s and 30s of last century, because this is essentially a debate about about impact of change of monetary policy in general. Yeah. So the question is whether if you are easing because you are building up inflationary pressures by any easing of monetary policy, can you stimulate the growth of nominal GDP? Yeah, that's the crux of your question. And let me say that I believe on this level. Empirical evidence resolved this question around 1935. Yeah. In this country, I believe some empirical evidence was generated by tragically murdered finance minister Rashid, who tried to restore economic activity by moving to pre-war price levels, which was not entire. Despite what a lot of people think, it was not entire economic success. The success was the stabilization of prices after he was murdered. Yeah. So that's in my opinion about it. I mean, like you cannot stimulate economic activity by tightening monetary policy in general level. And the reason why is. A small part of the reason is the effect you talk about, but the real reason, of course, is the level of economic activity increasing due to increase of competitiveness, which simply works because you decrease. At some point, you are sort of you are relaxing monetary policy. You are pushing all sorts of competitiveness up in this respect. And in terms of exchange rate, the effect is obvious. I mean, like this, you are simply decreasing the price of the economic outside of the market, and that simply stimulates the economy, and that's my answer for this. But especially for open manufacturing-based economy. But I don't think that. Again, I mean, like if you take a look on history, even very, I would say, closed, invert or domestically oriented economy as US one was quite stimulated by exchange rate step of the beginning of Roosevelt era. So that's my general answer. If I would be to believe it's not the case, I would have to learn what's so different in this economy that it justifies the opposite approach. And let me remind you, in such case, I would probably vote for helping the economy by hiking interest rate and intervening in support of the krone, which is obvious counterfactual of what you said, what this discussion suggests. And I somehow don't believe that would work. I don't believe that anybody in this room actually believes that would work. So that's my answer. I believe that's fair enough.
Jaromír Šindel, Citibank. I will ask you regarding your inflation forecast for 2015, because I see that in the first half of 2015 we have some 3% inflation forecast. And my question is, why do you target upper band of your inflation target for 2015. So my question is whether, let's say, lower Euro Czech target should be more appropriate for your inflation target.
I'm not sure if I'm to ask it. Let me, but I don't spend too much thinking about the about the longer ends of our forecast. Yeah, that's the first thing to say. This time I have to, because we cannot use the exchange rate to fine-tune in a way interest rate is used. That's quite obvious. But saying this, I think we've chosen 27 for next 2 years in a way that that it essentially confirms what we think is inflation target in the model. Yeah. But I don't think this is a real concern for now. I don't have any finite answer of when are we going to end in this respect and how, because simply there's too much unknowns at the beginning, and I believe this week probably added to their load. Mirek, do you have any more final kind of idea what we will do at the end of 2015?
Well, I don't think that I can shed more light on that, since actually, you know, once the inflation builds up, then actually we have to choose how to stop it, and then we can decide. The question is whether we will get there. So from today's perspective, be within 1 year within the bound on the lower side, the next year on the upper. If I know that suppose that it works like in the picture, then of course on average I'm on a target, and part of the monetary policy is also to try to smoothen and basically smoothen the shocks. So basically, probably what you would expect that we would somehow in the next year, we would probably 2016, which is not there, we would probably try to get the inflation exactly on our target. But that's so far, then it's difficult to tell anything else.
My name is Jan Čermák, and I'm from ČSOB. And I have a question which is related to the previous one. And it's related to the fact, what if Czech consumer will not behave in a rational way? How you expect? And actually, even in the medium-term horizon, will react to higher prices by cutting consumption, and it will start to search on Google pages for discounts, and then prices will start to fall. So are you ready to hike Euro Czech target again in a, let's say, a year horizon? Thank you.
Well, first, as I said, I don't believe this. There is quite clear trend in discounting on soft level data like leaflets and other things that we follow through internet searches and stuff. So we are essentially using soft data for this. But saying this. Well, as we said, what I believe is that people finally, and that's again the basic of this monetary policy effect discussion that I believe is what really happens in all circumstances. People simply believe react on wages and employment developments. Yeah. You are increasing competitiveness of the economy. Period. You are if there is a producer with 10% margin, which is quite normal in this time, the first order effect and is exporting, the first order effect increases his profits by half. The 5% depreciation increases the profit margin to 15. Or allows him to compete with 5% price cut. And that's what the crux of the effect always was, yeah. Because there were definitely times when the majority of consumers did not have any savings, yeah, and monetary policy worked. I'm not saying worked lovely, smoothly, but worked. Yeah. But the second part of your question is whether this is an unchangeable floor. I believe it's not unchangeable, but we said, and we announced it again after sort of carefully searching for a proper formula or mantra, that this is not an interest rate. Yeah? We will not change it unless we see some dramatic change that simply justifies such a relatively dramatic step. Yeah. So that's I cannot provide you more I would say clear answer because I don't have it. Yeah. It's at this moment we are trying to carefully anchor on all our mantras of this sort in our subjective feelings about economic future, because I must say I don't believe too much in anchoring mantras in quantitative targets. Yeah. Mirek.
You know, one of the reasons why I do not believe this is even the irrational behavior of the consumers is sustainable in the long term is exactly the effect of small open economy. If the consumers, who are also workers, see that actually the firms are doing better and their profits are go up, it would be completely irrational from them not to go into the demanding higher wages and actually seeing, well, I would be worse off while the firm is better off. So that's irrational. So even if you would have that setup on a mind at the beginning, after a while you realize that actually you are in the wrong crowd.
More question?
I'm Tata Ghosh from Commerce Bank. Quick question on official reserve levels. I mean, with this new policy, do you have any estimates of where the year-end FX reserve levels will be?
Well, I can have as big reserves in upwards as I need. Yeah, that's my answer on this.
No guidance on the volumes?
I don't think we have to. We don't have any big guidance. We have some ideas what or our traders, but I mean it's very unclear. What I can tell you now and what you can derive from what I have said and what we announced it, that we definitely do not need to intervene in last days. Yeah.
Good morning, Rafaela Tinconi from Bank of America. How concerned is the board about the ECB significantly underestimating the risk of deflation for a prolonged period of time in the Eurozone, and how much your answer would have changed had I asked it a year ago? Thank you.
Well, you know, one of the things that that also sort of worried the board was the development in Europe, so euro area. So for us, of course, that was seen. It was also mentioned by Tomáš that actually this is based on the assumptions what we have seen, that actually you won't have the deflationary period in euro area, and this is at least what we can hope for, and that's at least currently what the consensus of the market also is. But the worries, of course, they are the worries.
Well, it was definitely a factor that we took in mind when we were discussing the forecast. If you ask me, I believe I was quite clear that I don't think that Europe is in a lovely, nice, universal recovery, thanks to the fact that everything works smoothly there.
David Mark, Patria Finance. I would like to ask whether you think about the possibility to outline a more specific conditional forward guidance provided by the Czech National Bank, like the one provided, for example, by Bank of England or Fed. Thank you.
Well, I sort of touched it there. If you ask myself, I'm extremely skeptical on quantitative unconditional forward guidances, because I believe they assume I believe you can give a forward guidance on policy bias because it's essentially subjective one. You can and you should give forward guidance on your model or an assumption on future as we are doing. But once you start condition policy turns, you are essentially betting that you know the conditions and relationship in the economy not only now but also in future, in a very quantitative sense. And at the end you end up conditioning your precise numeric conditions on something subjective, and you are essentially trying to square the circle. And I believe some of us follow Financial Times. I believe they had a very nice column on those governors that believe in forward guidance on phoning home when they are going to turn on a dinner a few weeks ago, in the same vocabulary, which was sort of I will definitely be there at 8 unless some unknown conditions in weather or in traffic or in anything else force me not to be there, honey. And that's exactly what you end up with this sort of quantitative forward guidance. That is why I'm saying I believe we will end up as soon as we will be very sure, not in a normal sense of change of interest rate, but very sure we will not have to restart again in a foreseeable future. That's as far as I can go. Mirek, please.
I don't have anything to that. Basically, once you start thinking about the uncertainties, then you got the question.
Actually, let me add, I spent quite time thinking on this topic, thanks to the fact that it's popular. I believe the attractiveness of this forward guidances in models come from the fact that models assume you do it right. And therefore you decrease uncertainty, and you see everybody is happy because you did your forward guidance right in the model. But in practice, you are essentially doing one-shot guess, and that's a very different thing, as opposed to inflation targeting or any framework in which you gradually learn and get feedback and can correct yourself. So it's not about properly guessing once upon a time, but it's a process. So you now can feel that I'm firm unbeliever in trying to pulling yourself with pulling on your hair out of the mud of uncertainty, saying something certain.
Helena Horská, Raiffeisen Bank. I have maybe 2 questions, if I can. The first one is regarding the exit strategy. You are really ready to smooth the way in which the currency will move from your current target to some stronger level somewhere in the future? This is the first question. So if you will be ready and active on the market, or if not. And the second question, because I saw in some presentation that you mentioned that the nominal convergence should be done more now through the nominal variables like the prices and wages. And my question is, why not to change the inflation target to higher level, to at least 1 percentage point above the European one, to open the door to more nominal appreciation through prices and wages? Thank you.
Okay, well, the second part of the question was definitely to me. What I believe is that effectively we will have this situation in foreseeable future, because I believe Eurozone will have a low inflation for a foreseeable future, simply because as a matter of fact, ECB simply has to compromise between Eurozone and Germany in a way to keep its support. Yeah. That means that its inflation target de facto will be a compromise between the whole area and Germany that's facing upward inflation pressures. And that essentially means that the Eurozone will have very low inflation. So in a sense, I believe that this, in a foreseeable future, I'm not speaking here for years, but for sort of inflation horizon at least, or next year or two, that's something that I can envisage quite easily. And that simply means we will have, if we keep with our current target, we will simply have something like maybe bigger than 1% differential with Eurozone, sort of automatically with 2% inflation target. And well, I've been in exercise of changing inflation target once during my 8.5 years here, and again, this is the exercise I can feel enough for myself. Yeah. So I would not go to 3, but that's, you see, that's a long time horizon. Second thing to stress with this, obviously we may end up on floor or out of floor. And the foreign trade developments call for ending up on floor. However, if firms feel we may be ending up, they may decide also to shift some investments outside in order to secure themselves more competitive production places later. Yeah. So it's not only foreign trade, to put it in a different way. There is also other parts of forex flows concerns. Yeah. So that makes sort of speculation on what's going to happen difficult. Yeah. And second thing is, even with this, and then you have dividends and all sorts of other flows, of course. But second thing is, if I'm right about ECB and our future inflation rates, that essentially means the exchange rate need not appreciate that much as in past in order to speed up convergence. And that also has its feedback effect on my thinking about whether we will end up on floor or not, and what is a sustainable exchange rate. In a sense, once we return back to normal policy, I believe the monetary policy is driven by a pair of exchange rate and interest rates. So once you are out back in normal policy rate setting, sort of a lot of exchange rates are possible given the policy of central bank of open economy. I'm not sure whether this was helpful, but I'm sure it was long, sorry. Mirek, please. Tomáš.
Maybe again I will add one thing from the technical point of view. Actually in this forecast or in this inflation report, we also changed some long-term assumptions in our model. And I can imagine that if we had not started using the exchange rate as an instrument, maybe my presentation would be to a large extent about this change in the model setup. And well, this was actually, this is just a coincidence that the two things happen at the same time, because the change in the long-term parameters, it was long in the pipeline, but it takes a while to test all the implications it has for the model, etc., etc. So we were working on this at least for 1 year. And as part of this recalibration of the model long-term parameters, we actually significantly decreased the real exchange rate appreciation that we expect to take place once the crisis is over. So a kind of medium to longer term assumption. And the rationale for this was that first, a lot of nominal convergence or price level convergence already took place in the pre-crisis period. So the gap in our price level is much less than it used to be used to be before the crisis and when we were constructing our core forecasting model. And second, we also expect that after the crisis, real GDP convergence will resume, but it will resume at a much lower pace than in the pre-crisis level. So the pressure on the real exchange rate to appreciate in the longer run will be much weaker than what we were used to before the crisis.
All right, it seems to me that there is going to be a lunchtime, yeah? So I'll allow last 3 questions, and we may move downwards as we cannot do it with the rates, we can do it ourselves at least, and enjoy the lunch after them. Thanks. So please.
Vladimír Váňo, Sberbank Europe Vienna. I apologize for asking the obvious, but just to be on a safe side. So your traders have authorization for buying FX in unlimited amount? And the second question is, given the conditions in the Czech economy, you are not under severe pressure, even if there would be more sizable intervention to sterilize those corona cells? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, first thing, of course, we intervene in an unsterilized way. Yeah, that's and of course they have authorization to do what they do not have any limit. We simply told them keep it close if necessary with your purchases of forex. It's on your own mind to interpret it as you wish. So, given the market conditions, to be economical, of course, but that's essentially it. Yeah.
Maybe just technically, I often get questions on sterilization, and I think there are sometimes confusions. The liquidity that you issue once you intervene, it must end up on the bank accounts at the central bank. So there is no other way it could happen.
Fair enough.
And the question then is what interest you pay on this additional liquidity which is on your books. And because we are at a zero lower bound situation and the rates are technically zero, there is no way to do a kind of textbook sterilization. It remains in the central bank as deposits on our liability side of the balance sheet, but it basically receives no interest for it, or just 5 basis points per annum. So it's from that point of view, it's kind of non-sterilized intervention that you know from the textbook, but of course it doesn't mean it moves out of the central bank's balance sheet.
Thanks for adding. Yeah. So that's I believe that's exhaustive. Yeah. Another question, please.
Aleš Marshall from AXA. I would actually like to ask about the model. Like, since you put a lot of weight on it, you don't have in the model any financial frictions. You know, there's just few papers actually introducing the exchange rate intervention as a monetary policy rule. So there is not really conclusion on how to do it. And I also found some papers which are actually saying that close to the zero lower bound exchange rate interventions has very low effect on to boost the economy. So it actually might be that you are just introducing another uncertainty in the economy, and you are not gonna help much. So I don't know if you put some thought on it or some comment. Thank you.
Okay, I will start. The core model that we have has no financial frictions in it, but we have developed a few satellite models which incorporate financial frictions in various ways. And I think we have already published also a few working papers on it. So you may probably discuss it during lunch with Tibor Hledik, the head of our macroeconomic modeling and forecasting division, who is present here and who will join us for lunch. So he can give you the relevant links or references to the papers on financial frictions that we have done. And as regards the strengths of the impact of interventions or depreciation of exchange rate at a zero lower bound, basically I don't think it's going to be weaker than in normal times, but rather the other way around, because when you do it at a zero lower bound, you do two things at the same time. You weaken the currency, so you weaken the exchange rate component, you loosen the exchange rate component of monetary conditions, but you also reduce the real interest rate, so you actually loosen both legs of monetary conditions. While in normal times, when there is a depreciation shock to the exchange rate is loosened, but monetary policy responds by hiking rates. So real interest rate actually goes up. So the two legs of monetary conditions in normal situations work in the opposite direction, while in the current situation they work in the same direction, reinforcing each other.
I will probably add to that there is a paper, BIS paper that comes from myself and one of my colleagues on that topic that actually describes why we think the effects will be actually higher. But even if I would assume that you might have there might be some merit in the papers, then the question would be, well, the Czech economy is small, open, export-oriented economy. So if I bring more money into the economy, then it would be assumed that they are vanishing, and which is definitely not true.
Well, it seemed to me. Let me maybe move it on a slightly more general level. I believe that there is now a bit of experience with forex interventions with the same purpose or similar purpose that we started. And what seemed not to be working is any sort of covert, silent stuff. So obviously it must be announced and clearly stated. It doesn't appear to me from what I hear and see and read about other countries that it has not worked, at least in terms of inflation and growth. Obviously, it increases the balance sheet, which, quite frankly, I believe we are in better position than others, because we never delivered any profit to cantons in quite a few decades. And they are unlikely to expect it from us, as opposed to my Swiss colleagues, which are sort of in a different position in this respect. But saying it, so we discussed it with few central banks: Israel, Swiss, Swedish, Latin Americans. I believe maybe even the fact that more of us are in this is sort of enforcing and strengthening the credentials of this operation, because this operation works, in my opinion, only as soon as you persuade the agents that you mean it seriously and in unlimited, and at this moment no time limited horizon. Yeah, so. And as soon as it happens, it is an impulse for agents, especially on a firm level, to start changing their behavior vis-à-vis investment and general strategy. So that's my general answer. And maybe also what seems to me clear is that if central banking moved in some direction, it's in a direction that the central bank should not sit on its hands at clear deflationary danger, because it may, or even on the border of it, because it may end up as in a situation that our Japanese colleagues would probably describe as rather uncomfortable. And then actually you are actually in much worse situation. That's one thing. But second thing, maybe it's worth mentioning, we also started it frankly because we saw that the market loses trust in verbal interventions, or instead of real interventions, because this was what worked. And we did not want to definitely deliver a shock of saying we now need 4 cuts, but we will wait again. I don't believe the currency would not react on it, and then we might be in a much worse scenario, and much more expensive scenario, because we would be essentially forced to intervene, as our Swiss colleagues were. If you remember the story, they had to go for 20% devaluation essentially, or floor, because they allowed the currency to strengthen quite dramatically at the beginning, and that cost them much more. Yeah? So there is also a cost sort of issue of when you start and whether you surprise or not.
Radomír Jáč, Generali PPF. Good morning. It's obviously a question on very similar issues. Maybe for the beginning I would address it to Tomáš Holub. Simply the proposal and decision was to go via way of interventions to be active. My question is whether you considered and analyze situation that you would announce interventions, but simply at levels that were prevailing for some quite long time, let me say between 25.50, 26 against the crown, against the euro. I'm asking because many of these uncertainties that we are discussing here now and that are discussed in the media over the past week would be certainly much more limited in such situation.
Well, maybe I can try starting, because we discussed the levels. Yeah, that's and honestly here, at least in my mind, I was led by Swiss experience. I believe that they put a very credible eternal line in the sand finally. I also believe they would probably, if they would have a chance, they would put it on a bit weaker side of Swiss franc to get over this experience sooner. Yeah. And so what you sort of economize at the beginning, you may lose at the end in a different vocabulary. So you know, and then there is a question of if you choose something, you better sort of keep up with your long-term commitment, which in this case was inflation target. So 27 sounds quite handy in this respect, given you obviously pushing inflation at 2% next year would involve very sharp, abrupt change. Saying this, we are changing exchange rate by 5%, which except the last year in which we essentially artificially influenced in exchange rate through all period, and we all know it here. Frankly, that's not a huge change. Yeah, and you see it in inflation figures, 1.3 next year. If everything were smoothly and if the downward pressures won't materialize any further than this week, which is this week doesn't suggest so, frankly. I don't think this is a cruel, terrible price increase. Yeah.
I would probably add to that actually even in the past when you talk about the previous levels, basically those levels were sort of driven by the verbal interventions that we had, so that's fine. On the other hand, also in a sense, they were inconsistent with the fact that actually for delivering the inflation target, we would need either slightly negative interest rates or weaker currency. So even those past levels, they were inconsistent with let's say long-term horizon, and actually keeping them on the same level, you would just increase the inconsistency in such a way that the target would not be credible. So this was not an option.
This might have been the option half a year ago, let's put it like this, but not in current state of affairs.